commencer.
Hello, good afternoon. We'll now begin the last plenary session. It's a very interesting session. It's drugs and medicines. It's a very controversial subject, and it's very important because let's not forget that all drugs have been used as medication. And there are administrative problems in accepting the use of drugs as a medicament, and even with research or developing research to study the properties of drugs. But we have to look at the other side of things also. There's a lot of use of these of drugs as medicines in order to minimize the side effects of drugs. Of course, a medicament is not a substance to use for leisure, so that is why you have to separate quite radically the therapeutic drugs and the risks of leisure use. Both things are quite different. And on the other hand, medicines with drugs, we've had quite a few presentations about the big epidemic of opiates in the United States because of medicines that have been developed with drugs. And not only there, but also in Europe, we have a problem. We mustn't forget with benzodiazepine. It is undoubtedly medicaments that have significant abuse problems, and so there is a controversy. It's very polemic, and you can see the frontier between drugs and medicine, and so we have to make progress with that, and we have three speakers for that. First of all, we have Christian SUEUR from Paris, who's going to talk about psychedelic substances used in therapeutics and self-experimentation. And then we're going to talk about the international conventions on medications. And then Jean-Michel DELILE, who will be talking about new trends on this international convention, and Bertrand LEBEAU also. Thank you.
Bien, bonjour, bon après.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you very much, Jean-Pierre Loed, and all the ATHS team for all the excellent organization. I'm a psychiatrist, and I work at the hospital in Lyon. I belong to an association, Le Grec, and I'm president of. And we wanted to reduce risks a few last century, and we made a group, and we do the group of research, clinical research for cannabinoids and risk reduction. So we have a site, a website that you can see on the screen, www.grec.org, and there you can get opinions about therapeutic use of cannabinoids, and essentially in psychiatry, but also more broadly. I have no conflict of interest. When GREC is not financed by public or public institutions, we don't have anything to do with psychedelic producers. So there's a PayPal link where you can make donations. This is the GREC site. And if you're on the GREC site for publications and documentation, you have some articles about psychedelic substances and their therapeutic use. And today I'm going to try to give you some ideas in order to try to gather what neurobiology has taught us today, and recent research also about the activity of psychedelic substances, particularly LSD, psilocybin, on the central nervous system. You know today that there is responsibilities, or this affects neurogenesis and so forth. But if you just take those data to facilitate the therapeutic work of psychedelics as medicaments. We may forget the whole history of the use of psychedelic substances as medicaments. In other words, the fact that they were associated psychotherapy. So clinical experience is as fundamental as what pharmacological and neurobiological fields give us. I'm going to change my glasses. I can see there was an article by Shayla Love. So he's just read the name of the article in English. I wasn't able to repeat it. Is there an ethic? Do scientists or therapists have to try the drugs that they're going to research or the ones that they're going to use in their therapy? So I did a work with my colleague at a hospital and in this epistemological treatise, we talked about self-administration. On one hand, the consumption of cannabis by Jacques-Joseph Moreau and other colleagues in the 40s in the Hashish Club, which was in the hospital Bizet, and the therapeutic use of LSD after the voluntary self-experimentation by Bernard Stoll in 1947, and the first Albert Hoffman, the inventor, the chemist who invented LSD, were involuntary self-intoxications, and the scientific results are for better knowing the psychosis, and for the experimenters it was the project of using psychedelic substances for psychotherapy for various disorders or for therapy of well-being. We looked at this to lead the first experimenters to develop this with substances ever more numerous from plants or synthesized in laboratories, which are part of this category. So let's remember about this idea that psychedelic is a success word which was proposed by Haussmann in 1957. It etymologically means a spirit revealed, which makes what the psyche makes visible. Or they have this common feature of revealing the hidden or unconscious features of your mind or spirit with modified conscious, by modifying your thought and with deliriousness and hallucinations. LSD, tryptamines, for example, and others. Of MDA, DCB, he's listing a whole load of substances, and ketamine, which is antagonist of them, MNDA, salvinorin A, agonist of monooxidase, and the discovery of the hallucinogenic characteristic was accidental because he was working on other substances, the trip on a bicycle, which ended up in a ditch between the lab and his home. Scientific experience LSD began in Europe and the United with Werner Stoll. He was a young psychiatrist, son of the head of the laboratory. He was the first one to propose in 1947 the use of LSD in order to treat and he ingested 60 milligrams, less than the 150 milligrams when by Haussmann, once it had been synthesized. The most psychiatrists recommended the quantity of 150. A retrospective study with medical experimentation of LSD in California. It involves 25 doctors in France. Some psychiatrists also experimented, particularly in the Sainte Anne Hospital in Paris, with Professor Souleyrac or Jean DELILE, who accompanied ingest of LSD for Professor Bichon, and they did synthesize on the prescription of LSD to schizophrenic and other patients with mental disorders. And this was largely available in Europe and USA in university. And there was a certain number of press articles which popularized these experiments, like Timor Chilawe, and the use of LSD was taken to a larger scale in the 60s, according to Greenspoon and Pacala, the two psychiatrists who wrote the first book, Reconsidered Psychedelic Drugs, which talks about all of this. The psychedelic movement was a reaction to the existential crisis of the 50s, and it put mysticism at made it available to everyone. And it was a well-nourished country, but metaphysically hungry. And this psychedelic was a movement of various currents, and there were two trends. The first one was incarnated by Timoteri, who was a psychologist, and he was also and Ben also considered social relationships as a game of roles. And when he went to Mexico, he experimented with hallucinogenous mushrooms, and often then they tried LSD together. But the personal importance led them in '62 to create the International Federation for Internal Freedom, to allow every person to have more awareness of their nervous system. They were excluded from Harvard, and the persecution of the psychedelic movement began. And the American authorities tried to began to pursue, and he was finally arrested for possession of marijuana and ended up in prison. Leris was a critical of society. According to Leris, it was the most important to and the Vietnam War also put the students began to take more, and then the movement began to, and they stressed technology and music, saturated countries, and this was a group that was the source of psychedelic art. And the psychedelic movement had many other trends, like Allen Ginsberg, and many artists and musicians and other Charles Manson, pathological people like that. Those who followed the ideology refused the existing society. We are those people who our parents have warned us about. And then there was a new hippie ethic, and they invoked the Oriental Buddhism, Taoism, so forth, and also the Swiss philosopher talked about this. And the movement after 1969 began to split and into four directions: drugs, amphetamines, and opiates, the political fight, which became more radical in certain cases, marijuana, which came back to be more conventional, and finally meditation and the different means nowadays for New Age and mystical personal development. And then experimentation have essentially constituted experiments with volunteers, and in a much more perverse way with uninformed soldiers. And these experiments, and that was finally condemned by the American government in 1962. And then the hippie movement, LSD, mescaline, were classified in 1960 as in drugs, were prohibited in research centers. In the 70s, the psychedelic therapies had their first phase of experiments in those years. In the 50s, and the official prohibition was during the 60s and a general prohibition on drugs. It was only in the 90s that they had a renaissance, and even more now. And although now psychedelic substances were scientific and neurobiophysical, the self-experimentation by therapists, when this it is necessary for the development of therapy, then it is less questioned. And now there is a kind of cleavage, first of all, between the use of hallucinatory substances as therapy and certain cannabis, particularly CBD, as tranquilizers. Self-experimentation is no longer a criterion for growth. Then there was a slightly different approach to treat depressions and addictions in the context of a psychotherapeutic process, even if the discourse is based now on the pharmacological capacities and the interactions with other neurobiological systems. And this is the field of research where the close knowledge by the therapist or the research is timidly brought forward. This leads to a controversy between the older ones. There's a text by Peter West, which is called Psychedelic Elephant, and the modern ones, who particularly the London researcher David Knott, Carter, and others. And then there's a third dimension, and that is the use of substance considered as entheogene or entactogene. So they act on your human mood, elation, which put you into an active state of spirituality to accompany in psychotherapy, cannabis, methylene with MDMA, ecstasy, which was got its official statute in Israel as a medicine, and all accompaniment at the end of life with the experiments by Charles Cobbett at UCLA that MAPS has been offering for more than 20, the acknowledgement of the interests of cannabis and MDA, the Beckler Foundation, the FDR Institute, also working in the same direction with the psychedelic substance. These associations and research institutes finance most of the university research node, and they are the historic bridge between the early 20th century research and the current research. It is clear that today the biological psychology thought is, and the psychic transformation is part of the therapeutic dimension. The pharmacological aspect is adjuvant. There are therapeutic use of cannabis, and some of the cannabinoids have undeniable therapeutic effects with many patients, with many indications well beyond what the state of art recognizes. The results, which are documented with clinical trials, which are difficult to prove, particularly for psychos, pain, immunity, inflammation, and others. Special states of mind through psychic modification and the mood modifications are subjective therapeutic effects that cannot be measured in clinical trials. There is a big gap between what the solid evidence in the American Academy or the excellent document of Health Canada, or where all the indications of cannabinoids are robust, moderate, light, or not at all reliable. And so what happens in France is to have very few indications that are medically or scientifically proved, but in the clinical and reality, there are many indications to show us that the effects of cannabinoids are positive. And this shows you the broader positive elements, apart from the psychedelic movement in the US, where the consumption is Hoffman and Stoll, the self-experimentation by psychedelics, the pioneers. We have Concite, Roger Heim. He was a French professor of mycology in Paris, and other mushroom specialists who worked on magic mushrooms in the 50s in Paris in the Museum for Natural History. He participated. There was an article in 1958 called A Report on a Self-Experience with a particular mushroom. He said that Roger Hamming, having absorbed 32 fresh of Mexicana mushroom, had become had gotten into a state of drunkenness, and Hoffman decided to use higher doses. As is always, he always exaggerates a little bit, because. And that is how, in the 1st of July 1915 at 4 p.m., he ingested in his offer 32 dry Mexicana mushrooms of 2.4 grams. Then his vision began to modify, and objects came closer and got more distance. He wanted to be taken home. The symptoms increased, the sensitivity to acoustic and optical stimuli increased, the roads and familiar streets changed in a devilish way. When I got home, I sat on the settee and I tried to sleep, but it wasn't possible, because I had colored image and abstract, which changed completely and permanently. And with this drunken state, I had a kind of a cyclone of colors, and I lost consciousness of myself, particularly when I made movements. All of this was frighteningly felt, and with anxiety. Hoffman is a recidivist and didn't use reasonable doses, even with LSD, and this enabled him to identify the active molecule of psilocybin. But he lived healthily up to the age of 103 years old, and when he was 93, I met him in Amsterdam, that he had begun these self-experiments and that he was getting on very well. But these doses it was thanks to these pioneers that we can know what are the usable doses. And Alexander Schulden also made some self-experiments, and phenylethylamine that I have known and loved. And the speaker's reading very, very quickly, so I apologize if I missed some things. And with Tikal, tryptamine, and there were 55 tryptamine, which are odysseys. And Albert Hoffman. And then sometimes the pictures were no longer so abstract, and so this is one of the early descriptions of how the imagination imposes itself on one's conscious. It not only distorts your perception of sense, but it also you have ghost dreams, which are manifested independently. Well, normally they are acquiescent and hidden in the subconscious. So I recovered to the extent that I was able to get up, and I had the impression that I'd come back home to my country. There was a dilation of time, and Hoffman had come to be in a reassuring and well-known place, which will face him to his finality. And with the dissolution of his usual mood, feelings, and Alex Luxay was the first one to also mention his self-experience. Henri Michaud was another person who worked with critical self-analysis. And he has access to his unconscious under his own terms, and he became the spokesperson for the mentally ill. And in 4 of his books, and particularly Knowledge by Taste, that he realized the effects of some delirious effect. And through psychotherapy, you can talk about Ansgar Lohner, which after 55 was the inventor of psycholytic. He prescribed small doses of LSD to his patients, which facilitated emotional catharsis process. And this micro dosage was developed in certain artistic and scientific groups, and psychoanalysts in England also did that. Abraham Sandhofer in Canada were the pioneers of care of alcoholism with LSD. And then also we can quote heroin addiction and the psychedelic, and this can be for the treatment of opiates. And in St. Petersburg, Krubinsky treated hundreds of heroin addicts with ketamine. I haven't got time to talk about more about Stanislav Grof, a pioneer in Czechoslovakia between 56 and 57, in Baltimore in USA from 67 to 73, and closer to us, Shulgin and his wife Anne, who was psychotherapist, and they continued the chemical of the of tryptamine and other hallucinogenics, and Alexander's scientific experimentation and the use of products considered to be the most interesting in the therapeutic context with his wife Anne. And so when we look at their work, their writing leads us to a practice for patience and self-experimentation through the modified state of consciousness is one similar to drunkenness. And now, to repeat from the Imperial College of London, there was a Renaissance movement on and Peter Gassel on Switzerland, or Kropinski. So when you want to have bridges between science data and practical applications, when they are authorized in Europe and France in the rehabilitation of medical cannabis, there are many things I could tell you about cannabis, and he's skipping a lot of things now. So we have to remember that there are four categories: the self-therapeutic, the leisure, and the collective drunkenness of us, and then trance, which is a bridge towards shamanism or towards God. And this enables the transformation with the synesthesia of injuries not cured. In a shamanic experience, you can have a new vision of your suffering and your history, and you can participate and change the memory. There aren't medicines that have proved their efficiency with PTSD. The daily clinic shows that cannabinoids, and particularly MDMA, you can, with psychotherapies, you can transform psychotraumatic pathologies that are very serious. And if you want to, you can read the text next week on the GREC site. So to be able to have psychedelic therapies, it is important to know at what moment, in what state, with whom, and with what kind of product, but that is not necessarily what is most important. Metzner gave some rules at the end of the 80s, hallucinogenical, modify your state of consciousness, where for behavioral modification, but it also provokes the questioning of the nature of reality. And existential questioning, and there are the hypnosis, trance, meditation, or other states of modification of the psyche. Metzger has repetitively been repeated. The first one was the analogy of the amplifier, which gives drugs a non-specific amplifier of the psychic. The second analogy is the metaphor of the microscope. They can it's a similar role to that of a microscope to verify the inaccessible psychic context. The fourth point, always unlike other substances, it is recognized that the personal experience of the therapist is a prerequisite. The communication between the therapists and the subject in a psychedelic state is severely limited, and so as a consequence, one of the important parameters is the expertise of the therapist and the quality of his previous experiments. Majority of psychedelic do not consume the drug at the same time as the patient. There's an extra transcendental religious consciousness that can be attained, and it is often that the capacity of recognize the psycholytic experience are similar to the natural mystical experiences. A very interesting work published by Peter Webster this year, who has experienced this over 60 years. It's a book called Cosmos. You can look it up on the net. And there's a philosophical work on. I encourage you to read it. If you read English, I will conclude by quoting. You know the story of Freud. Even psychoanalysis it was born out of experiments on yourself, and to treat nervous illnesses and depression, the first indication was with morphine and alcohol addicts and Anton Fleisch, and the passion for hyperdenic. But the first victim has and he was regretted not having been there when his friend died because of the fate armand, and he continued to use cocaine for himself, nevertheless, until his death. And then he began his work on the interpretation of dreams, and that is how we were able to. His own use of cocaine, his experimenting with himself, was part of psychoanalytical. And pharmacon, these substances can be poison or medicine. It depends on the dose, on the place of who takes it, how it's done. And it's true that the medical context should be able to give a few guarantees, but I think the next speakers will be able to talk about it. The interpreter apologizes, but the speaker was reading a text which we did not receive at a very high speed, so I transmitted what I could. Are there any reactions or any questions from the auditorium?
Pour l'instant pas. Alors, il est évident que...
Well, it's pretty obvious that self-experimentation is probably a source of enlightenment, and what was described and in conditions that were not really controlled, and all the experiences that are reported were very interesting. Of course, it's going to differ from one person to the next. You have people with psychological disorders and others won't. There are a number of things which stems from serendipity. This is something typical. And around this different consumption, we have interesting knowledge. It helps in understanding a number of conditions. When we draw a parallel between those that experiment things during those in this state, may give us avenues in the neuropsychological avenues that are involved, but also people that are trying to self-regulate, to self-treat their condition, they can have an improvement. You also mentioned a number of conditions in which today, the therapeutic routes are limited, especially from a pharmacological point of view. There are psychotherapeutic approaches as well, and I'm sure that Jean-Michel will talk about it. So we do see that there are a number of mechanisms that become clearer, but in some cases it would be useful to be supported from a pharmacology point of view. We see that we have a number of patients who have a hard time entering therapy. I'm talking about psychotherapy from an introspection point of view. And so maybe we would need a combined therapy, but maybe we've not understood the whole thing from a neurobiological point of view. You mentioned a number of products, a number of side stories. And so it demonstrates that there's a lot of riches and everything that happened in the past, well, we should leverage the knowledge that we have, maybe not necessarily reproduce what has been done, but try to see how we could help for therapy, some therapies that would benefit from further experiments. We see that a number of products that we've known for many years could potentially, again, open further avenues for treatment. Maybe we should increase the specificity of action, and we're going to discuss about it in a minute. All those products used as such can create a number of issues, and therefore we need a lot of control on those products so that the benefit-risk balance remains favorable. So we should try to get inspired by the best that this product can provide so that this can be used as drugs. But again, this is the problem of the right balance, striking the right balance between a medicine and a psychotropic substance. Do you have a comment on this synthesis? Well, I have a comment. The wide variety of products. Well, there are some products amongst those you mentioned. Some have psychoactive properties, but also many side effects, like for ecstasy. But there are also products that are not psychoactive, like cannabidiol. And on a different point of view, product like cannabidiol, or someone takes cannabidiol, they're going to have a subjective point of view. For some of them, it's not going to do anything different from having water. However, we do report an anxiolytic property. Yeah, but for let's take an animal model. If we give an animal cannabidiol to try and demonstrate the subjective effect of a drug, and when we perform substitution studies, well, in an animal which is not aware of taking a drug, in most cases, there's no effect whatsoever. Yeah, but again, it really depends from where you're coming from or where you stand from. Again, people most of the time, they say, well, I feel good, or I feel better. Really depends from the situation, a timeline. So maybe, Jean-Michel, you would like to react to that? Well, yes, I fully concur. And this is the entire part that I could not mention because it was too long. Well, yes, indeed. So cannabidiol is not a psychedelic substance. However, we need to recognize the psychoactive effect. Nicolas Autier mentioned that yesterday. So they do help with mood swings, but it doesn't change the state of awareness. So cannabis can be considered as a psychedelic substance, but again, it depends the route. So they will use dawa musk, which is nothing else than jam with cannabis, and therefore the THC and potentially CBD came into the preparation of that jam. And I think it's very interesting from an epistemologic point of view. If you want to have a pharmacology conventional point of view on those substances, how we can avoid to have this devilization, how we can avoid this diabolization of those products. So again, I think Margaret yesterday also said that in cannabis you have no less than 250 substances active on the nervous system, while for LSD or heroin or cocaine, it's only one substance. So you should really make the distinction in between all the different substances. So at some point, those drugs were considered as a medicine, and now they're considered as a poison. So, well, it's starting. We're starting to use psilocybin in resistant depression. Well, just a few words. I'm delighted to see you, Christian. We hadn't met in 20 years. We were the first working on DMNA. So I'm quite happy that we are here together today and about obviously talking about the same topic. Well, despite my age, I have a rather modern take on this question now about experiments. One of the questions, and it was well said, the question of blending. On psilocybin in depression resisting to treatment, all patients do make a difference between placebo and the hallucination drug, and it's difficult to find an active comparison drug. So you can't have a double-blind study. So what is interesting in the studies in New York on psilocybin, but we'll tell you more about it in a moment, is that you have a huge bias when you have someone with depression resisting to treatment that do not want placebo. They want the real thing. And again, this is not to shade this research, because I think it's a very nice research, and I fully support the use of the application of some of these hallucinogenic substances in medicine and psychiatry. But we do have a problem of methodology, i.e. not being able of blinding the subject and having a double blind. Well, yes, and there are expectations as well. And so it does change the situation. So there are high expectations. It's going to translate at the beginning more on the long term. We will be able to see whether it's really efficient, and the efficiency is not only linked to expectations, but really to the pharmaceutical expectancy. Now we're going to give the floor to Bertrand LEBEAU. He's going to discuss drugs, medication, and international conventions, or international agreements, rather, that are framing those substances.
I'd like to thank the organizer, Jean-Pierre Brouet, ATHS, Colina, because they have allowed me to talk about the two subjects I'm passionate about, psychedelic substances in the part, and now I'm going to talk about international conventions or agreements. And as a doctor, I'm not at all an expert on international agreements. However, those who work in risk reduction or addictology or self-support should spend some time to study these agreements and conventions. We don't know what their role will be exactly in the future, but they are the common law of humanity right now. It's a long history. I'll try and go through this quickly. The modern history of agreements is the one that is still the most important, which is the unique 1961 convention, because it covers all the precedent ones, particularly the ones that were signed in the Society of Nations. There are two characteristics which are interesting, I think. The first is that the 1961 convention is characterized by the fact that it was not limited by imposing rules concerning imports and exports. The idea is that countries have traditions or national legislations, and in a certain number of cases, a country may have a substance which is legal, but it's not legal in the neighboring country, and so the work on conventions is for that. In 1961, the convention insists on the fact that this convention has to be able to be adapted nationally, country by country. And there's a second element, which is less important, but is nevertheless significant, and that is in the preamble. It explains that the concern of this convention is the physical and moral health of humanity, but it does not mention, and this has some consequences, it doesn't mention the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. And so the second question that is posed is, who are the stakeholders in all of this? And when you don't know the subject, we want to pull our hair. What are the structures? The first one is the International Organism for the Control of Drugs. It's the INCB, it's the International Narcotic Control Board. And what is this entity? It's almost a legal entity with 13 members. They do not represent their countries. They're there in the quality and with the rule is to supervise the implementation of the conventions. For a long time, we've said that the main strategy of INCB is to name and shame. In other words, that their power was essentially a power of pointing out bad students. I'll give you an example. When Switzerland decided in 1992 to have programs of heroin prescription, they were pointed out by the INCB. But that power is even more considerable because we are affected by the decision. If you are indifferent, the power of the INBC disappears. The second structure that has a central role is the expert committee on drug dependence belonging to the WHO. The initiatives about the classification of substances are usually made by the CDT. And then there is a structure which in the last instance will decide to say yes or no to the proposals of the experts committee of the World Health Organization, which is the expert commission of non-trafficking drugs, which meets every year in Vienna. For the first time I was there this year, and I hope I'll be able to go next year also, because I'd like to follow up on this work. And so the CND is made up of 53 countries, but all the countries of the planet come every year, or most all of them do, to the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, which once more, in the last instance, will decide. So I have now to go into something which looks very bothersome indeed, but which is absolutely essential, and that is the history of the context of the conventions. So I'll tell you a very brief story. I've tried to read Malcolm Lowry's book, Below the Volcano, until I was told that the first chapter was the last one, and then I was able to read the book In the Shadow of the Volcano. And I will try and summarize as simply as possible, because it's not as complicated as that, really. There are three conventions. The 1961, modified by the 72 protocol, the 71 on psychotropes, and the 1988 Convention on traffic and precursors. There are two contexts that I'm not interested in. I'm interested on the four, and this is the difficulty. In the 1961 Convention, there are four contexts or sections, which is the high-risk substance like opium, heroin, psychedol, methadone, cannabis, cocaine, and coca leaf. And then there is table 4 or paragraph 4, which is crucial, because in this paragraph there are substances which are not simply dangerous substances, but they have no indication and no therapeutic activity. So what do we find in this fourth case? And that is cannabis and cannabinoids. In the 1971 Convention on Psychotropes, that's a little bit different, because right from group 1, we are dealing with substances that are dangerous without a therapeutic use. All the classic psychedelics are there: LSD, psilocybin, DMT, mescaline, all of them are there. In group 2, you have amphetamines, and 3, barbiturates, and 4 diazepam. But really what is important, what you have to remember from these conventions when we are talking about them, is that cannabis are in 1 and 4 in the 1961 convention, so dangerous without therapeutical use, and all the classic psychedelics are in the section 1, dangerous without therapeutic interest. And so obviously every day makes these conventions more and more absurd. So I have to tell you something else, and that is that the ICDD recently decided to analyze the question of cannabis, which it hadn't done for 53 years. And they decided 2 things. Well, they proposed to the CND that we'll decide next year, decide on 2 things. And the first thing is not to classify the CBD because it doesn't have any effects, and the second decision was to take cannabis out of section 4 because there's no therapeutic use when it's in that section. But however, they've conserved cannabis in section 1. So I'll translate. They have opened the door to therapeutic use, and they haven't moved 1 inch about for the use of cannabis for leisure uses. They've probably done that for political reasons because they've said to themselves, perhaps what we are proposing will be validated by the CND. And also, when we're talking about 61 is a simple majority. In 1973, it was a qualified majority. But anyway, they made that proposal, and the CND will decide the following year. I'll give you 2 examples of the tensions that exist between the use of a certain number of substances as medicaments and the international conventions. In my opinion, the best example is the ketamine example. Fairly quickly, I think 1985, the expert committee on drug dependence of the WHO classified ketamine as an essential medicament because of its anesthetic properties. It is the anesthesia that is most used, particularly in poor countries. It's also a respiratory depressant, and the risk of mortal overdose is very low. And so, therefore, it is a medicament that is very used in surgery, obstetrics, and in many medical and surgical situations. And that is ketamine. And at the request of China and the WHO said it couldn't classify ketamine because when it is classified, it'll become very difficult to obtain, it'll become very difficult to prescribe, and it will be a disaster for public health. On 3 occasions, never the years that this occurred don't matter, but China and the OICS came back and attacked, but 3 times they stood their ground and said that they didn't want ketamine to be classified, and the CNM didn't want to discuss that because the CNM can only talk about what the CDD talks, and they can't decide one way or the other. And there's a second question which is also extremely interesting because I think this is a little bit outside the subject of therapy, but this is status of the coca leaf for the policy reform of drugs. After cannabis, it's a question of deconstructing prohibition progressively, and then there's a critical question, which is the coca leaf. Many people think that it should be classified, but Bolivia was never agreed. Bolivia said that there's good coca, our good coca that which we used, which was a symbol of the Inca Empire, and that there's bad cocaine, which is born out of Western chemistry, which is dangerous. And Bolivia, therefore, has always been very reticent of this classification of coca leaf, and they refused to sign that convention. And in the end, they obtained President Evo Morales obtained in January 2013, managed to get Bolivia to be able to sign the international conventions, except for the question of the coca leaf, because there was traditional consumption of masticated coca leaf in Bolivia. The second problem, and this also deals with substances that everyone agrees that have a huge therapeutic interest, but they are under control, and that is opioids. So I'm just going to give you a small figure which shows you to what extent the situation is terrible. I think 40, or the 10 biggest fortunes will represent of the 4 billion poorest people on earth. These are frightening figures. I'm going to give you another frightening figure, and that's that 92% of these are OICS figures, so they are credible. 92% of the morphine legally produced has, for medical use, is consumed by only 17% of the population, mainly in Northern Hemisphere countries. And this situation is due to many factors. It is true, there's not just the conventions, there's the training of doctors, and some countries have set up some rules that are so complicated that nobody has access to them. But nevertheless, the conventions have to, according to the text itself, have to find a reasonable balance between, on the one hand, the prevention of the misuse of substances like morphine and guarantee access to controlled medicaments, because otherwise we end up in a situation where approximately 75% of humanity does not have access to these medicaments, and so these are frightening degrees of suffering, and more than 165 countries in the world do not have any opioids they can prescribe. And I've been inspired by three things to tell you all about this. A remarkable book by an Englishman, Hewlett Taylor. Well, he might be American, and he wrote a book called Drug Policy Control. It's a remarkable book, and he studies not only the conventions, but he also. The book was published in 2012. I don't think it's fully up to date, but it is a fascinating book, and I really recommend. And the Global Commission has published two documents. Also, the latest is very recent. That's the classification of psychoactive substances, whilst science is not listened to. And this is from 2019 on opiates. They've published in 2015 the negative effects of the control of drugs on public health. The world crisis has been of useless suffering, and it talks broadly about the obstacles, the barriers that the international conventions give for access to treatment against pain or in substitution treatments. I'll give you another figure, which is also interesting. We assess approximately 7 the RDR programs, 7% of those who what should be financed, if we wanted to have policies of risk reduction on a world scale, are funded. Only 7%. These figures are not good. We don't know how long these conventions will last, but do I have a couple of minutes left? I suppose I'm coming to an end. Okay. So there are a certain number of problems, but I'll give you an example. You know that in the conventions, you will never find tobacco, alcohol, which, as everybody knows, these are drugs without any danger. But nevertheless, the WHO has a big program to fight tobacco addiction, because there's 13% of humanity where they live in countries where there are reasonable anti-tobacco policies. In all other countries, it's just advertising that is crowdfunding is 10,000 times more mortal than morphine, but that's not true. So you look at the number of deaths, because of 100 million people, the forecast of the 21st century is 1 billion, because there were in China, India, Africa, and Latin America, they smoke now like we used to smoke in the 50s. So in the end, the WHO has taken initiative with regards to tobacco. I don't think there is one for alcohol, but the ICS is obliged to acknowledge that the conventions are not balanced. In other words, that they fight ferociously against trafficking, but they haven't started up at all the tools that allow access to medicaments that are narcotics, which are under control, like morphine. And I'm not going to give you a list of all the opioid methadones, peptidine, and all the opioids in general. And that situation, therefore, is not an acceptable situation. I'll round off by reading this little extract, which is taken from the Global Commission text. The current system for classification of drugs managed by the United Nations treaties has so much historic prejudice and inconsistency that it's almost irrecoverable. Only a group of experts who've contributed to the process of review of the WHO of the current situation, where several important substances, for example, cannabis, cannabis and heroin and cocaine, have never been assessed, or at least not for 80 years. And deprive them of legitimacy, and also their ancient evaluation does no longer correspond to scientific knowledge of the day. Thank you.
Merci, Bertrand.
Thank you, Bertrand, for respecting the time allocated to you. We have a few minutes to listen to your potential questions or comments, either from the public or the speakers. Well, thank you for this presentation. We see how difficult it is, or it was, to have a legal framework, obviously, to try and protect and also control. But we see today that this framework is no longer adapted in the context of rapid change. We see that everything changes very quickly the world over. With new technologies, it's easier to travel. Also, the products are available on the internet. So it is very complex. And the regulatory framework, which was implemented a long time ago, should certainly be updated in the light of this pretty much changed situation. Now, this applies to cannabis, for which we have a wider knowledge base, and the social acceptance is certainly not the same then and now, and also drugs like opioids that are very important. And on the other hand, we have the current crisis in the United States, which make it quite urgent to adapt the legal framework so as to limit the risks linked to abuse. So it is complex, and we see that in the French regulation, which is nothing else than a translation in the national context of international regulation, there are new products on the market on a daily basis. And so we're always lagging behind the new products. And so we need to find a strategy which make it possible to adapt to this rapidly evolving situation. Just a couple of words. Of course, I agree with the sort of not updated version of the different frameworks, and I know it is very complex to update that. At the OICS, so the International Body for Drug Control, they do change in the way they implement the tools. Professor Jamal Tufik is a psychiatrist very much interested in addiction. He's an expert from Morocco. He also was a fellow teacher in Bordeaux, and so I asked him, so what happens when it comes to risk reduction? Well, Russia, China would like to have a more stringent implementation of those regulations. And the colleague said that so far they try to hold their ground, and they try to maintain a framework, but also try to open the door to some risk reduction programs. So the regulation seems to be less on the repression side, so there are changes which are not necessarily widely publicized because they need to take into consideration the point of view of countries that are really against such changes. Well, as you said previously, tobacco is certainly a legal drug, and yet drug and alcohol are also responsible for quite a lot of suffering in our society. So there's a gap, and this, of course, also contributes to fostering preconceptions and also the point of view of people on those substances. Can you hear? Yeah, we do. Well, I comment on the harm reduction side or paragraphs in those frameworks. Well, ONU, SIDA, and the WHO do take risk reduction very seriously with substitution, the injection rooms, needle exchange programs, etc. However, in the official documents by CMD, you will never find a sentence saying that there are risk reduction measures. In Lungas, there was a Congress last year, and they didn't talk about risk reduction. Why is that? 25 years ago, the high-profile activists of risk reduction were against prohibition back then. And so we fought, or at least at the UN, they thought that risk reduction was probably a Trojan horse trying to get a foot in the door and then eventually to get legalization. Now, if we had waited for the legislation of 1970 to change in France, then we couldn't have implemented risk reduction programs. Now, it is true that the legal frameworks tend to change at a slower pace than society. Now, at the world level, what is the situation? You have on the one hand the Latin countries. They are eagerly waiting for reforms, and it's not by chance that Uruguay was the first country legalizing cannabis. You know, the situation is Mexico, which is quite appalling. The number of deaths attributable to cocaine and drugs is enormous, and this is one of the reasons why the coca leaf could be legalized at the world level, but I'm not going to develop my thinking about that. Now, we are faced currently with a situation where we have considerable problems, and we cannot envisage that the situation remains as such. Now, on the one hand, as I said, you have the Latin countries. Brazil seems to be a counterexample. The government by Bolsonaro seems to be thinking differently. But there are questions of safety, and the high number of homicides, most of the time related to drugs, played a major role in the election of Bolsonaro. So you have the Latin countries on the one hand, as I said, and the European country on the other hand, sort of agree with a form of progressive prohibition. But then you also have countries like Russia or China, not talking of Philippines or Indonesia, in which you have more and more crime in connection to that, so as you don't really know whether they account for 15,000 or 20,000 people. But those countries do not want to hear about risk reduction. And you know that at the UN, they work on the basis of consensus. And so those two last countries that I mentioned do not want any change. So the situation is pretty much blocked. And it's a sort of stalemate. Are there comments from the participants? Are there questions? If such is not the case, we are going to listen to the third presentation by Jean-Michel DELILE. He's going to talk about drugs, medication, psychotherapies. Are we heading towards a mixed cure? Well, Mr. President, thank you, Jean-Pierre, for inviting me. I see this opportunity because I come here on a regular basis, and I'm always delighted to do so. But this is the first time that I come as the president of a federation in favor of addiction, and so I am delighted to thank you on behalf of the entire industry and all the members of our federation, because you did contribute to our industry in the last 40 years. I've known you for maybe 20 years, but Jean-Pierre is a friend of mine for more than 40 years. He used to be an assistant at the hospital Charles Perrin when I was an intern, and I was always very surprised by his ability to talk with everybody, and he was very good at talking with people from the resuscitation room, and then we use that machine on our drug addicts as well. So he was very curious, very creative as a person, and thanks to that we started having contacts with CPDD in the United States. Well, the second point, which was important in his career, it's because he was a pioneer in substitution treatments, and this certainly is central in the presentation that I'm about to make. He would say, well, when you have a heroin addicts, why wouldn't you prescribe lobdenum? Lobdenum was a medicine which could be perceived as a drug. And so we thought, well, how is it possible that a drug can be used as a medicine? But then you know the rest is history, with the development of substitution treatments in our countries. And also there's a third reason, which I think is key. ATHS is a wonderful congress, a wonderful conference with a very nice atmosphere in a beautiful city. So once again, thank you, Jean-Pierre.
So we thought about organizing ATHS to talk about the subject of drugs and medicaments, and that arose because of the opioid crisis, and there could be these good medicines, sometimes when they were withdrawn from the patients, they are substituted by heroin or carfentanil. And so there was a confusion, obviously, between drug and medicines. And what I added at the time, there's another field with psychedelic drugs can become medicaments. And with what is happening internationally, notably in the USA and the UK, so I had to present something on trip treatment, which Christian presented before, and I'm going to go back to that now by broadening by a new element, which is very close to me, which was very well introduced by Christian. If we take the use of hallucinogen substances as catalyzers of psychotherapy, these advantages that had been mentioned, Cary granted he'd learned more about himself with a trip than with 10 or 15 years of psychoanalysis. And so something that was interesting at the time. Then there was all the problems that there were, and that was stopped. And I think to a large extent the future of hallucinogens is to come closer with psychotherapy. In other words, to find the fields where they're most efficient. That this is the fusion or merging, and we try to overcome the gaps between the takers of psychotherapy or takers of drugs, and perhaps it is necessary to have global approaches that will allow people to be offered, depending on the demand, an approach that can have a psychotherapy and medicaments and hallucinogen substances as a treatment. So let's recall what's happened in the past. We know that there are drugs in the US, but there haven't always been addiction problems as far as we know. But we find that in traditional societies, usage was regulated. This was mentioned very well by Christian before. This is an initiation in iboga, and it is in Gabon, and this was done with under controlled situations with medical aims or magical aims, and you can see how the drug was perfectly tolerated, just like the coca leaves in the Andes or in Bolivia, Peru. In certain circumstances, can have atypical use, and there on the top right, there's a shaman psychedelic traveler who's tried to cure psychosocial problems, often with drugs, with initiations to iboga, and this is going to be perceived by him as a medicament, but it will be prohibited and classed as a drug. But if we look at iboga, which is psychostimulant, which we find very quickly that in France and in Gabon had used it as a stimulant medication with Lambarain by Dr. Schweitzer. He very quickly was able to identify it as something that could be, and recently it was proposed as an anti-addictive substance globally. However, we've been able to see some undesirable effects, and particularly since 2007, after 2 deaths, France, under the proposal of the Commission of Narcotics. I was part of that commission, so you can ask me about it afterwards if you want, had decided to classify iboga as out of control. It could be the subject of sectarian drift, and with certain usages it could be problematic. And so the general idea is that we have to allows us to think that on the one hand there are beneficial, not very dangerous, good medicaments, and on the other hand bad drugs that are addictive, dangerous and toxic, that would allow us to think that the solution would be in measures of prohibition. So everything that we're going to see through different illustrations, this has already been mentioned and explained very generally speaking, they're all the same products. So it's much more the context of use prescribed, or not the quality of the prescription, the quality of the prescriber or the users, which are going to mean that the same product could have beneficial effects, or for other people it would be fully dangerous. And this complicates the task of international organization in order to separate the good from the bad. So with pharmacone, potions, on the left, everything that's good, the medicine, the pharmacist, the patient, beneficial amendment. On the other hand, the bad product, the poison, the drug, the witch, the dealer, the drug addict, and an illegal product. But we will see in our presentation that it is, in fact, the same product. So the coca leaf we talked about, quinquina, digital has a bad brand name, and the example that was given before is perfect, and that's cannabis. The negative effects are well known. I think you know them by heart. The beneficial effects are also well known, but perhaps too restrictive in France. But I had the opportunity of having been questioned at the Provisional Scientific Committee on Cannabis, where a certain number of proposals were made. And I think it is a great deal, it is a step forward if we're beginning to authorize the experimenting of therapeutic cannabis in certain contexts of very precise prescription. One point of divergence that for post-traumatic PTSD, I question that, because quite a lot of previous work say that in the long term, cannabis has a negative effect on traumatic disorder, post-stress. So that is my point of view, but we can discuss that. And the poppy is a superb plant, morphine, and the heroin on the right. And we know all the problems of use and abuse of opioids among drug users, or with patients who have intersections with opioid antalgics with severe complications, and particularly in the United States. So in the West, and this was said in the introduction, most or even all drugs, when we're talking about products that are generally identified sometimes early on as medicaments also. So there's morphine, amphetamines, heroin, LSD, ketamine, and everything. So regulations for the negative effects, but these medicaments can have value as a drug, again, like codeine, and with deaths that occurred of teenagers even in our country. And so where the situation becomes totally evident is with the antalgic opioids, with the American crisis. The same idea goes for with benzos and others. And drugs can have therapeutic effects that have been unjustly neglected because of what has been seen before, cannabis and psilocybin. There was an expression which was any hallucinogenic substance will be classified as soon as it's got a hallucinogenic power. It isn't assessed, it is classified. That's no longer the case, but there's such a reputation of the problems because of those products that this has blocked any kind of experimentation. So to summarize, it isn't, there aren't as such good and bad drugs, but benefit, risk. Well, opioids, you can see OxyContin, you can see the dramatic role of different things, of the proximity in the 90s between certain companies and certain academic areas. And that means that the discourse of the laboratory around the fact that OxyContin, because it's long duration of action and other things, would have an addictive potential and a greater dangerousness. And so, and the same time, campaign which said that it was legitimate and recognized pain as a symptom that had to be treated, should facilitate access to all kinds of products. But you maybe agree that you indeed have to systematically treat pain, but it isn't always beneficial to treat it with oxycodone. And many of the chronic pain, and so cancer is also linked to difficulties in life, to social adversities, and when the social adversity in the Midwest was treated with opiate, that meant a loss of control with the disastrous results that we are familiar with. And so the authorities in 2010 have gone back on the broad opening of oxycodone with a reduction of sales. However, what has been replaced, oxycodone has been replaced by heroin, which has increased. Heroin is even more toxic. Mortality has been accelerated. And so that means that these kinds of mechanisms, once they're launched, it is extremely difficult to slow down. The regulatory measures have led to an acceleration of the problem. However, the authorities are less responsible because these are products that are bought on the black market or on internet. The current projections, you know, that mortality is a Vietnam War per year with 40,000 deaths, and the projection now is 304, so it's an epidemic level, so it's going to be a health catastrophe, which is massive, with a medicament which was published, and it was published that it could be a drug. Well, ketamine, this is a subject that I'm very interested in. This was an article that was written in the American Journal on Psychiatry by a number of, and this is what was said at the beginning. It could be the best of things or the worst of things. This was this is a quote by Dickens, and you can see the excellent medicament. It was a remarkable anesthetic without affecting respiration. So it means that it's like a special K, and you can see a horse trying to get doped with ketamine. And in our and it's used in our countries, particularly in nightlife. Ketamine was used in 1970s as an anesthesia. There's not much discussion about the interest of this product, and there are even indications now in the field of depression, with a relatively fast effect, which is good for resistant depression with an indication which is coming up more and more, and it's important in the reduction of risk of committing suicide, and it's nasally administered, and this is being studied with Janssen, and this is an old trial because the trial is now finished. We have an ATU with cohorts, and now they can prescribe ketamine in resistance situations. And where we warn the authorities they have to avoid in France what happened in the United States. There are many of the clinics do not follow the good usage recommendations, and the conference of psychiatrists in the United States said that we could give some instructions linked to resistant depression, which even resists the types of therapies, but that's all. But indications are being broadened more and more, particularly with chronic pain, with compulsive disorders, post-traumatic migraine, that when that is admitted to someone who's got an anxiety disorder, is going to have an appeasement effect, which is quick at first, but psychologically, clearly there's a risk in terms of loss of control, abuse, and putting the person into danger, the addictive potential. It's an MDA antagonist. There's clearly an absence of blinding. Ketamine is like hallucinogen. If you compare it with a placebo, you can tell the difference immediately. So next to ketamine, there's a resurgence of interest for other products, less of dissociative products like hallucinogen like LSD. And so the question that is posed, therefore, so the question is whether these products act because they have a direct effect that are antidepressant, antalgic for, or analgesic for cannabis, or is it euphoric? For us, for therapeutic cannabis, there are a lot of experiments that show that it's the effective dimension of pain, but that's true, it's right. So you have to relieve those people, but on the other hand, you see that you're there in the heart of the, because there's also a psychotropic dimension that may have a globally beneficial effect for people who have a disorder. But in some cases, this beneficial effect is a potentially addictive psychotrope, can lead to complex consequences, and that is why you have to think about the right conditions for its use. And this is to assure you can prescribe esketamine now since the 23rd of September. These are nasal sprays of 28 milligrams and 1, 2, 3 sprays a couple of times per week, I think he said, and the cost is $4,700 or $6,800 for the first month, and so it's very good for. But we still don't have the naloxone nasal reimbursement approved yet. And it's not easy to get that in our country, so this would be a little bit ambitious. These are the T-shirts of those who are for and those who are against. Bottom right, ketamine is just for fools and horses, and the others, life wouldn't be worthwhile living if we didn't have ketamine. So that's the opposite T-shirt. The trip treatment. These are some statues. These are my. This is my anthropological side. This is more contemporary. So the modern version. This was mentioned before by Christian. There are extremely serious publications in the U.S. and England that experiment. The Lancet, the British Journal, Medicine, Nature, and so far, with clear indications for resistant depressions in status of advanced cancer. The risk-benefit is good, but it is broadened for resistant depressions and post-traumatic, but with MDMA much more than with cannabis. And so psilocybin This is a hand-drawn diagram. It's less stigmatized, and American experimenters said that LSD was so much maligned that they couldn't psilocybin. People don't really realize so much that it's hallucinogenic. And so it is used with small dose in there, just a single dose. And this is what is interesting. One single dose delivered in a very secure environment with well-trained people surrounding you would allow you to obtain a real experience of spiritual opening with a massive and durable for cancer patients in terminal phase. So therefore, the quality of life was considerably improved in those situations. This is a hospital. This is a trip treatment hospital room. It's quite different to the usual hospital rooms, as you can see, and the doses of 0.2 milligrams of psilo per kilo. Calmness, and the results are positive, and there's a bias that should be reassessed, and that is that obviously this was proposed patients could say no, and those who didn't know and who were and people who had an experience when they were young, then they were more likely to accept, and that was in the 1960s. So obviously, that is something that has to be verified, but nevertheless, this is very promising data. And now, what about the hypotheses? Christian talked about that. We managed to do studies now in functional imagery to be able to see what is happening in the minds and brains of these people. This is a big mystery in our field with molecules, is why these molecules, instead of being alive every day, and this is interested by these are ones that act after one single ingest in life, or one take, and this is atypical in our world. So schematically, it seems that it is a kind of a reset, and in the end, these are results which have meant that these are the subject effects of these drugs are caused by a connectivity which are diminished in key areas in the brain, and these are the orchestra conductors in the brain which manage our moods and so forth, and that means you can hear sounds or a light, but you can see a light whilst you have an emotion. Apart from that, there's this cognitive freeing up, and this was observed by Hoffman as you can go back and remember the history, and this has a psychotherapeutic action because it's not haphazard, and if to a certain extent it allows you to have great progress in discovery of yourself and in psychedelic adventures. Here you have the comparisons with placebos. There are rarely differences like the perceived effects by, this is the blocker, and with placebo, it's gray. They just do not match. You can see effects there that are classical hallucinogenic, but also of profound interior peace with mystic feeling. And this surprises people. Among the experimenters that were totally atheist, thought spirituality did not, and suddenly they found themselves in the situation where they opened out to the world and with merger with the cosmos, and a kind of interior peace which gave them a minimum serenity when death is coming closer. These are people going to die, and that with that interior peace, they were allowed to welcome their family and friends and to help them even when they come in. I'm ready to go to the other side. And so it is a mystical experience. And this is the imagery, traditional Indian imagery. So it could be the centers of vision, and without the orchestra conductor being able to organize something. One hypothesis would be is that there's a dissolution effect, and then a reset, which allows you to understand that that may have a relatively long-lasting effect. This is a study that confirms what I've just said about the possibility of having a durable effect with the hypothesis of the reset, what is interesting is the neurobiological modifications that you get are comparable, and this is below, right, so that we don't know what ECT is, an electroshock. And there, with some electroshocks, you were surprised to have depression resistance and effects that were very durable, not always, but often, and therefore with a much softer version and more pleasant for people. And so the MDMA versus ecstasy is so MDMA is a good medicament. It's been said before. It's just been put on the market with that, with this post-traumatic indication in Israel, and we know it is in the final phase of evaluation in the United States with a fast-track mechanism, which means that the MDMA will be put on the market in the USA with post-traumatic stress situations for next year. And in terms of evolution here, we have to wonder about the implementations from a regulatory point of view, but also, in my opinion, we have to contextualize the indications. If in the case of post-trauma, it can have a useful, long-lasting effect. The MDMA can have formidable effects and even some deaths, as we have seen in our country recently. So the hypothesis, which is being put forward more and more, is when we try to see how it works with post-traumatic stress, it facilitates the relationship with therapists, the capacity to talk about yourself, to memorize the traumatic event without being pervaded by anxiety. So it's like a euphoric drug, but the pathogen, and there is a better alliance with the interlocutor. There we come back to the hypothesis of modern theorists with it can be a psychocatalyzer, and with limited doses, we can develop psychotherapies which are assisted by MDMA with sessions according to protocols which are well laid down. So if that is probably verified, that would allow us to envisage that we can really break away from the current paradigms with the first evidence-based demonstration of a global treatment in psychiatry of a fusion cure, which is pharmacologically assisted, which doesn't just act on symptoms, but durably modify the evolution of the disease wellness. So these are global cures, but put cure fusion to do a bit of a mix. But we mustn't forget, however, these products have been categorized. There have been many accidents at the time. It was the generation BME. I wasn't not an experimenter of all of these things. However, my predecessors all had been my psychiatric bosses, probably not Jean-Pierre, who's my age, but our predecessors, and Professor SUEUR, the late professor, welcomed us in an office with psychedelic paintings that he had painted himself. And now, in our generation, and they tasted the antidepressants, neuroleptic. They did it a lot. It was quite common. And and at my time, things calmed down, but I don't know why, because they'd had problems, and even among colleagues, and that they'd been and suddenly their vision, which was blackened a little bit with their experience, and hallucinogens you had to always look at them with a lot of caution. So don't prohibit yourself from researching or looking, but nevertheless, you have to be cautious about broadening the use. I'm coming now to the conclusion. And the conclusion, I will generalize a little bit here. We are saying, or I say, that what breaks away from the previous approaches is using a psychoactive substance as a booster, really, for a psychotherapeutic treatment. And the shamanic role is absolutely essential. We mustn't lose sight of the fact that this idea has to be broadened. It's not just simply, dare I say, for hallucinogenics. There was an article that impressed me greatly in 2001 in the American Journal, who asked, what has the biopsychosocial psychiatrist become? Because he prescribed medicines and didn't do psychotherapy. And there were others who did psychotherapy but didn't do any medicaments because they considered that that was complete poison and it was closing the person's mouth. And what the psychotherapist Gabad said, those that work the best is the possibility of being offering things from both sides, psychotherapy and medicaments when you need it for a particular problem. But what worked best was an integrated approach that you can ensure and for the same person, if you can adapt the therapeutic response and the accompaniment depending on the person's needs, but in any case, not to close yourself to a simple response. And recent, with double randomization studies have shown this, but what sets what the person concerned has chosen is what usually works best. That the pharmacon image of coral reefs, it's not because a product that has therapeutic effects that it's not dangerous, and it's not because a drug is dangerous that it cannot have any beneficial or therapeutic effect, and it's the same drug in both cases. And this is the dual illusion. It would work if there were goodies and baddies, but there you can see that there's a difficulty. It's more to do with regulation with regards to research about benefit and risk with regards to a society or an individual. And that is difficult for international convention, but there's another dualist vision, and that's separating the mind, the psyche, and the body, and everything that is spiritual. And you can see in more and more publications that show that the most efficient actions in medicine and also in psychiatry and also with addiction obviously have to have the potential of intervening on a different level via medical and psychosocial and you have to act as globally, just as you do with stress, trauma, social adversity, and you can get much more long-lasting and efficient results. And this is the end of the end. This is the self-criticism by Tom Insel. This is remarkable. You know, he directed the NMIH for 10 years. That's the American Institute for Mental Health. He boosted it a lot with a dominant hypothesis, which was a genetic molecular biomedical approach. He invested a lot of money, and he researched. On the left, you have the article in the JAMA. These are the voices that will allow us to reconceptualize the mental disorders which will affect the psychiatric practice. And then he said he pushed this. And when I look back, what I have managed, when I think about all of the articles published, done by normal scientists that have cost probably $20 billion, I don't think I've thought the life of the patients one iota, all their problems, and so this is an admirable self-criticism of one of the greatest propagandists of like George Coops and other authorities. And I think that now we have to go to the living psychiatrist, Kenneth Kendler, who has the most publications on the subject. He's the official psychiatrist of the community. He is also biogenetic. He's worked in all mental pathology. What does Kendler say? This was in 2019 at JAMA Psychiatry. The search for the cause of medical and psychiatric disorders has gone through 3 historical phases, with Pinel, Esquirol at the early 19th century. There are many temperament, climate. There was all kinds of things, food, the surroundings, and at the end of the 19th century, under the influence of the lessons of infectology and discovery of microbes, there was a monocausal approach which just legitimated the cause of a malady. There had to be a structural logic, and he says also in medicine this is no longer the case with infectious disease now. chronic pathologies now are linked to behaviors and which are multi-causal level of life adversity conditions, habits, eating habits, and so we've lost that model of an illness with one cause, and the only place where we're still monocausal is psychiatry, and that is the most complex organ, and with this permanent interaction with the environment and surroundings, with the atmosphere, with stress and meetings. But he says, of course, and you have understood this, that now we have to progress towards a complex etiology, the multi-causality, multiplicity, therefore, of responses. And thank you with that. With this talk on complexity. Thank you very much, Jean-Michel, for that brilliant presentation, which covers broadly all the different elements that we've been mentioning, and which picks up on what was said by the previous speakers. And so this appeal, stimulates a lot of questions. There was a strategy mentioned by Jean-Pierre from Limoges. It makes me think of neuromodulation, and you talked, of course, about uncoupling. You can see now you have to think about the neurosignals and how to modulate the neurosignals. It's not one neurotransmitter, and you've shown very well through the images that there are systems and cerebral regions that are interconnected. You can see very well the psychiatric manifestations, the behavior that is associated, linked to dysfunction of neurocircuits, that they are in turn affected by different neurotransmitters. And you know that in neuromodulation therapeutic is stupid magnetic stimulation. These are physical approaches, and you can also, and through neurochemical, through pharmacology, you can do that.
Now, so you talked about using MDMA to help with deconnection, and on the other hand, MDR. So this is really this uncoupling, this disconnection, which is tracked by eye movement, a movement which apparently still exists in the paradoxal sleep. So this is well demonstrated, but today we would need integrated research to try and see how those actions coexist with a neurochemical substrate, and maybe we would have the same system. Why would we need that? Well, you talked about pain. Today we know that the neurobiologic determinant in pain are the same that we have in the brain. So the actors are going the same, the neurotransmitters and the areas of the brain are the same in cases of psychiatric diseases and pain. So this is not by chance that the drugs that we use in our conditions are the same that we use in pain. And this is also why we have to be extremely careful when we use those drugs in people with chronic conditions. And this, of course, also begs the question of the use of MDMA. We could be used for PTSD, and patients with PTSDs, we have tons of them. Of course, we need to control this type of management. And this brings me back to amphetamines. We know that amphetamines are very much used in chronic pain. We know that there's an interest in case of depression resisting to treatment. It's used as an anesthetic. It's used also in case of depression. And it seems that this drug is more widely used as a nasal spray. And so potentially you were a member of the Commission on narcotics. What do you think about this? When such a drug is more widely available, don't you think that this may create further problems? Because if a problem is prescribed with so much control, don't we think that we're going to be faced with further issues? And the interest of addictive vigilance, which would be a system whereby via notifications and risk management, we could help and support and also design regulations. We mentioned the international regulation, which do exist, but are not necessarily adapted to a particular context that you mentioned. And therefore, there's a gap here. And so there's an interest within a country to have a body where you could support, control, and avoid such misuse in a context which is rapidly changing. So many questions, many comments. I would like to have your take on that. Well, in the room, I see people who work at the Agency for Medicines, the French Agency for Drugs. For a long time, I was also a member of the Commission for Narcotics and Drugs. And I was recently reappointed at the Permanent Scientific Commission on Narcotics, Medicines and Drugs. And I was here the day we voted favorably for the classification of Iboga. Now, personally, I'm in favor of opening as many channels as possible so that we can experiment on those plants and molecules for research. I would even go even further, and I would be very favorable for the use of those different substances in people in pain, provided that there are the right assessments and the proper control. Now, obviously, I'm fully aware, and this has been demonstrated by the opioid crisis, but we need to be fully aware that in the same context, the same drugs may have deleterious impacts on a different person. So from my point of view, we need to, we shouldn't be overly thinking in terms of black and white. We need to strike the right balance and have the right benefits risks ratio. And this is where an agency like MAN comes into play. I think one of the reasons we lost control in the United States is probably because there are representatives of the industry. You know, the industrialists in France and the United States are the same. The only difference is regulations. The fact that in France it is not allowed to have advertisement, the fact that the leaflets are being controlled and checked, controlled to prescribers, and also we have independent bodies which do investigate when we ask for prescription authorization for any indication. When we started those drugs on as painkillers, the authorization was pretty easy to get. But then when they were more widely prescribed for any other reasons, this is when we ended in a difficult situation, and this was the perfect recipe for a catastrophe. Now, if we had such a request at our agency for medicines, I'm not sure that we would have agreed with that. Yeah, there was also a question on ketamine. It is true that we look back in history, ketamine and the risks that go with it, the most important risk are the pro-psychotic effects plus the risk on the heart rhythm. This is a very elective drug, and I'm going to ask my question in a minute. I think the main critique for ketamine is we don't really know what is the duration of effect. But so there's a quick onset, but we don't know how long it's going to last. So it's not exactly as an electric shock wave treatment, but we don't know for how long ketamine is going to be acting in the brain. Do we have additional information on that? Well, to my knowledge, no. And that is the reason why there is a double control. It's a second-line treatment in case antidepressants have been unsuccessful, shock waves have been unsuccessful, so you can go to ketamine. And it's also rather advisable to continue antidepressant concomitantly. Now, when you look at the mode of action, there's probably a booster effect initially, but then it sort of dies off. Now, it's not too bad because it helps people to get some hope, and it may help in that respect. And provided that you have a psychotherapeutic support, which is not included in the leaflet, but I do believe very much in an integrated approach. So it's not so much the duration of use of ketamine on depression resisting to treatment, but it's more how the patient is ready to work. This is why I'm not so much in favor of those integrated fusion type of treatment cures. Because obviously when you have a rapid onset, but then the effect sort of fades very quickly, then, you know, it's not really helpful, is it? Yeah, of course, we need to take into account all the risks. And it's true that well, on the other hand, when you have someone with a depression resisting treatment, suicidal thoughts, there are limitations. And what is really the duration of action? Okay, very well. Well, in 1992, I attended the 8th conference on AIDS in Amsterdam. Could have been in Boston, but I think that people didn't want to have the HIV-positive people to get into the country. So anyway, I realized that there was an international movement for risk reductions. I met people from the Netherlands, people from the United States, Patrick Ebrard, sitting right opposite me here in the public. So we experienced that at the same time in those days. And it happened that this year I went to the Breaking Convention near Greenwich, and this is one of the biggest scientific conference of academics on psychedelic drugs. It's once every second drug. I came back with a pile of books, which I haven't had time to read so far, but I had the same impression I had when I exited the conference on AIDS in 1992. Today, in France, I know of no single research study who currently works on those classified substances. On ketamine, there are a number of teams working on ketamine, but ketamine is not classified. If you remember what I told you before, thanks you to ICDD for holding their ground, because for a long time ketamine was about to be classified. But to my knowledge, but correct me if I'm wrong, maybe MSN can provide us with this information, there are very few teams, if any at all, working on psilocybin, or LCD, DMDMA. I'm not even sure that there are such teams. Oh, and I forgot the last thing I wanted to say. Oh, I forgot. Yeah, okay. About the double-blind design. For a long time, I didn't understand how you could have double-blind with psychoactive substances, you know, by nature, until I discovered the works on active placebo. So active placebo is not a fully satisfactory solution, but it expresses the problems in different words. I don't know what is your take, Christian, on that, but most of the time methylphenidate is being used as active placebo because it changes the completely stupid nature of a double placebo with type of structure. I mean, it turns to a caricature. You know, when you're supposed to take a substance which is going to induce a state of ebriety, you can't give saline. Well, every time that they use an active placebo with methylphenidate or psilocybin. Right, are there other comments or questions from the public? Well, if not, it is 4:30. We're going to close this session. It was extremely interesting. I would like to thank everybody who stayed here until the end. And I think Jean-Pierre DELILE is going to conclude and close the conference. Thank you to the speakers. Thank you to the participants. Thank you for the high quality of the presentations.